Today, like I say, this is kind of a kickoff. We'll have a sermon in between, a kickoff when we look at the birth of the church in the very middle of Matthew, 16th chapter, a pretty famous passage. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter, there was fuzziness on the part of the other disciples, but Simon Peter nails it. He says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answers him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you this, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Remember those words. This is what we're going to preach on. "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. On August 24th of this past year, I was invited to be the keynote speaker at a meeting of the clergy women of the North Texas Conference. I was kind of excited. I've been a speaker all my life, but I don't think I've ever been referred to as the keynote speaker. And so I went down with a keynote address for them. I don't know whether I was helpful to them or not, but they were helpful to me because a gifted young clergy person by the name of Julie Klossner gave the devotional before I gave the keynote address. And I told her, I said, "I'm going to use this. This was a great illustration. I don't use other people's illustrations very often, but I said, I'm going to use this when the time is right because this was pretty brilliant. And today the time is right." She brought her solar eclipse glasses with her. Do you remember these? Fortunately, I kept mine. And she said, "You know what I noticed on the day of it was right after the eclipse, some of you may remember. She said, "What I noticed about these glasses is that when you put them on, you can't see anything whatsoever except what you are supposed to see." I thought that was rather brilliant. And it was true. I bought these glasses for members of the family, and I remember going home at noon. We were about halfway through the eclipse, as I recall, going home at noon and picking up my glasses off the breakfast bar and walking out into the backyard and putting them on. And I mean, I had to be careful where I was going. I was stumbling because I couldn't see anything except the one thing I was intended to see. I thought that's a wonderful way of looking at the ministry of Jesus. Now, the next time you're reading through the New Testament, especially the Gospels, you might think about this. In many ways, the preaching and teaching ministry of Jesus is a way of him confronting people and leading people and teaching them, telling them, "I want you to be able to focus on the one thing that is most important." So, for instance, when he comes across the tax collectors, he says, "I know that becoming very, very wealthy is extremely important to you. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I want you to focus on what is the one thing that is really of great importance to you, and that is the kingdom of God. What does it mean to sit at the heavenly banquet table? What does it mean to live in the kingdom of God now and in the life to come?" He comes across people who are blind, and he says, I want to give you sight, and it's because I want you to be able to see clearly the spiritual dimensions of what God lays out for you in your life." He comes upon the disciples, and they're out there fishing, their chosen vocation. And he said, "Look, I know your vocation is important to you, but come and follow me, and I will teach you about the one thing that's most important in your life, and that is leading people to God." There's this great story in the Gospel of John where he comes upon a woman at a well, and he knows her story, and he says, "Look, I know you are very concerned about the men in your life. You've had many men in your life, and you're looking for the one who will be your husband, the one you can love forever. But he said, I want you to focus only what is most important. I'm standing before you, and I am the well that never goes dry. If you believe in me, you will live in the kingdom of God in this life and the world to come forever. In some ways, I think his teaching, preaching ministry can almost be summarized by the story we talked about a few weeks ago when we talked about Mary and Martha. And I made the comment that Martha's like a lot of us. She was a type A personality, busy, busy, busy. But in this sense, Martha was like all of us. Jesus turns to her and he says, Martha, Martha, you are distracted by many things. There is only one thing that really matters. And so that's what Jesus does. Jesus constantly says, put on the glasses that allow you to focus out everything except what's really important in life. And so we see that at work in today's passage. He has gathered the disciples around us. And we've talked about this before. The disciples weren't really the sharpest people in the world. They hadn't gone to college. They didn't have degrees in theology. They weren't necessarily people with extraordinarily high IQs. It was always a process. Jesus trying to teach them, help to open their eyes, help them to see the realities he was talking about. And so he's gathered them around him on this particular occasion, and he wants them to see this one thing, who he really is, the Messiah, the Son of God. And so he asked them. It's a famous passage. You've heard this before. One says, people think that you're Elijah. Another person says John the Baptist returned. Some say Jeremiah. They're confused. They're really not clear about the answer to this question until Peter takes his turn. And Peter on so many occasions makes a fool of himself, but on this occasion he nails it. Lord, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus turns to him and he says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. Only God could have revealed this to you. Jesus and Peter in sync focused on exactly the most important thing in that moment. And then something happens, and it's really important for us to remember this. Jesus turns to Simon, and he speaks the church into existence. He does it with these words, blessed are you, Simon Peter, from now on you shall be called the rock. The rock. And upon this rock, upon this foundation of a rock, I will build my church. And then he tells him to organize the church. Whatever you bind in this life will be bound. Whatever you loose in this earth will be loosened. In this moment, the church comes into life, comes into being. Now, interestingly enough, we don't really know about the church. We never see the church in action until we turn past the Gospel of John. We turn to Acts. The book of Acts is the story about the early church. And we see the early church beginning in the second chapter being formed and organized. And then we see the work of Peter and Paul and others throughout the book of Acts. But in this moment, we see the thing that is most important for us to see. And we just go to the title of the sermon, Why the Church? Why the church? People ask that today. Why the church? The reason we have the church is because Jesus clearly saw the church and gave to the disciples the responsibility for the church as the way in which ordinary human beings would continue his work once he was gone. It's that simple. Without the church, the work of Jesus does not continue. Peter, from now on, you'll be the rock, and upon this rock, I will build my church. The reason this is important is because we have people asking this question all the time. Well, why the church? Do we really need the church? We've talked about this, the loss of confidence in institutions in America today. When you poll people in 1960 or 1970 and you poll them about their trust in institutions like the church, like the Rotary Club, like the Boy Scouts, like Congress, you name it, very high levels of trust in the institutional life in America. If you want to know what's happened in America over the last 40 years, it's the loss of trust in those institutions and the weakening of those institutions. The only institution that still scores high in terms of social trust in America is the military and our first responders. Congress, down at the bottom. All these other institutions, down at the bottom. And so people ask this question all the time: why the church? And the answer is clear. The church is because Jesus said this is how we do our work. And he told Peter to organize the church. I have a friend, I've quoted him a lot of times in here. I love how he handles this. He said, I run across people all the time and they say, well, you know, I believe in religion, I just don't believe in organized religion. And he says, I always say to them, there's no other kind. That's the only kind of religion we have. It's organized religion. And when you look at what takes place here in this moment and you follow the building of the church in Acts, that's the power of the church. It's people coming together, claiming Jesus Christ, organizing so that we can do the work of Jesus more effectively. And so people say, you know, I like religion, I like to pray now and then, but I really don't like the institutional church. It's just into institutional survival. I don't like the organized church, until all of a sudden they need the organized church. Did you notice what happened a few weeks ago when Hurricane Harvey hit the Gulf Coast? We could talk about the other hurricanes as well because it happened with every single one of them, but we'll just stick with Harvey this morning. Hurricane Harvey hit the Gulf Coast, and all of a sudden people saw the magnitude of the trauma and the damage and the pain that this would cause. And you would turn on the TV. I don't know about you, but I turn on the TV. In the secular media, you never hear mention of the church. And if you do, it's almost always pejorative. It's almost always negative, except for Blue Bloods. I like Blue Bloods because they always sit around the table. They have a prayer. They talk, you know. But every place else, on TV, on the radio, and mostly in the newspapers, nothing ever good is said about the church. But as soon as Hurricane Harvey hit and people realized what was about to take place, you saw the governor and the mayors and the other organizational people up there at the microphones, and they said, you know, we're counting on Congress to give us some money for this, and we're counting on FEMA that they'll be here, and the Red Cross and the churches. My God, we can't do this without the churches, and we need the prayers of the people of the churches. I don't know whether you were watching and tuning into that, but I saw it over and over again. And there would be Congress people who never mentioned the church, or a senator says, thank God for the churches, because we need them now and we need them organized. Occasionally I even saw a Hollywood personality saying, we need prayers and we need money, and thank God for the churches that are there to serve, to do the work of Jesus. This is really about the church, but I want to say something about Christ Church. Christ Church, this church, has the largest organized disaster response ministry in all of North Texas, Methodist ministry for sure, in all of North Texas. It's amazing. They don't get much staff support. These are volunteers. They're called to this ministry. They are passionate. They can never wait to go. When they're needed, they pack up and they go. I don't think there's been a single disaster since Katrina. In Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, West Texas, if it's a fire, if it's a flood, if it's a tornado, it doesn't make any difference. They go. And they are extraordinarily committed and compassionate about this. They've trained all these disaster response people in our conference since Hurricane Harvey. I'm tempted to say they're the largest in Methodism. I don't really know that. Preachers are kind of prone to hyperbole, you know. I have a lot of colleagues say, oh, we're the biggest in all of Methodism. I really don't know whether that's true or not, but we might be. If we're the biggest in North Texas, it's possible that we are surely one of the largest. And my point is, not just that we've already sent 2 teams down there to Beaumont where they've been doing remarkable work, but that we're still going. You see now that the TV cameras have been turned off. And the special reporters in their rubber boots and their hats standing there in the rain and the wind, now that they've gone on to some other place. Now that we don't see the governor or the president or whoever standing on TV talking about Harvey, guess what? The church is still there. This week we'll send another team of 27, the largest we've ever sent. Because that's what we do. That's the work Jesus gave, and he said, do it through the church. The church organized. And individual churches down there in Houston and in San Antonio, the South Texas Conference, this Texas Conference, the Texas Rio Conference, those churches are still open every day. Their food pantry is open. People still sleeping there. The prayers, the cares, the concerns, the work of the people of the church. I believe in religion. I just don't believe in organized religion. There's no other kind. Sometimes we need to remind ourselves of who we are and who we are called to be and why we do it. I don't know about you. I really just been kind of ad-libbing this morning, but I will say to you that I'm concerned. I'm anxious about what's taking place in America today. We are as bitterly divided as we have ever been. And I'm old enough to look back and see that what's been happening to us over the last 40 years, the trajectory that we've been on as a country, parallels the trajectory of the decline of institutional trust and health of our church, of all of our churches. I don't think that's coincidental. I was in Frisco Friday night. I went to Frisco in 75. I left Frisco, that was 42 years ago. I left Frisco in 1980. When I left Frisco, the population was 1,800. Believe it or not, 1,800. And I knew almost all of them. So I was in Frisco Friday night at the funeral home, a little funeral home over there, to say goodbye to an old friend, Pete Hosp. Great human being. He's a Baptist, a really good friend. Be with his wife, his widow, Gracie. And so some of you know what this is like. I can go to Frisco almost any day or night, and I don't know anybody, but you go to Frisco to stand with Pete and Gracie, and the remnant of that 1,800 was there, the ones who are left. And I don't know how this works. There are times when I can't even think of my wife's name. But you walk into a place like that, and all of a sudden you see somebody you haven't seen in 40 years, and you recognize them. You call them by name, and you hug them, and you pick up the conversation just like it was 40 years ago. It's just amazing. Some of them, you've only seen them sporadically for the last 40 years. And so it was a sad occasion to be there with Pete and Gracie, but it was also a kind of joyful reunion with dear friends. You know how it goes. And I was getting ready to leave. Been there for a while, but I was talking with a woman who I've known for 4 decades. And she said this to me. She said, "Don, do you remember that sermon you preached 40 years ago?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure. Which one are you talking about?" And she said, "The one where you walked out in the center aisle and you finished by saying, 'Who's going to teach our children about Jesus if we don't do it?'" She said, I will never, ever forget that. For 40 years, I've been haunted about that. Who's going to teach our children about Jesus if we don't do it? She said, you know, you said the church is only ever one generation away from extinction. It's still a good question, isn't it? Who's going to teach our children about Jesus if we don't do it? Who's going to tell our children that they are, in fact, the children of God? Miraculously weaved together in their mother's womb, knitted together in their mother's womb by a God that loves them, if we don't do it. Who's going to tell our children that it's okay to have a focus on your career? Can be a really powerful career, but don't forget the most important thing is the kingdom of God. Who's going to tell our children that in spite of who you marry, the most important thing in your life will be the children of God? Who's going to tell our children that you can get as rich as you can possibly get, but don't forget the most important thing is the kingdom of God? I just am at this point where it's time for us to recover the power and the commitment and the energy of who it is Jesus calls us to be. Peter, you are the rock. Go organize the church, because upon the church I will build the kingdom of God. If we don't tell our children about Jesus, who's going to do it? Maybe it's time we picked up our Jesus glasses and got focused on what's really important again, our church glasses. Maybe it's time that we got organized, really organized, because that's what Jesus calls us to do.